Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be covering two of the animal tissues. Now that we are done with the plant tissues, we come to the next section of this lesson. This is lesson 1 of grade 11. So under animal tissues, we actually have 4 animal tissues that we need to discuss about. The first one is the epithelial tissue. And the second one is the connective tissue. And thirdly, we have the muscle tissue. And finally, we're going to be discussing and learning about the nerve tissue. So in this video, we're going to cover the first and second type of tissues. We're going to be learning about the epithelial tissue and the connective tissue. All right. So let's start off with the epithelial tissue. What is the epithelial tissue? It's basically a tissue that lines up the surfaces of our body. So to understand this, I'm going to take, as an example, I'm going to take our skin. Now, our skin is the outer lining of our entire body, right? Our entire body is covered in skin, and that is the outer lining of the body, right? So if you take our skin in this outer lining, the topmost layer of cells that I'm drawing in this diagram, this outer lining of our skin is made up of epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue is basically a tissue that comes up and lines any free surface on our body. Let it be an internal surface or an external surface. Epithelial tissue is a tissue that lines up the surface of our body. So this epithelial tissue will cover up the entire outer surface of our body, right? And so this is an example of an outer lining, right? So to think of some inner linings, for example, if you consider the nose, the inside of your nose, the nasal cavity, now this is also a free surface, and this is an inner lining, right? So this too, you will see that over here, this lining contains epithelial tissue in this lining. So epithelial tissue is basically a tissue that comes up and lines up any free surfaces, mainly to provide protection, but also in addition to providing protection, it also does many other functions as well. So given here in this diagram is a diagram of a tongue. So even if you consider a tongue, the outer lining of the tongue, this entire surface, this surface that is exposed, is made up of epithelial tissue. This is also an example of lining an outer surface. So this tongue has an external surface, and that too is lined with epithelial tissue. And thinking of another example, if we consider our intestines, basically the inner part of our intestines, this entire inner part of our intestines too is lined up with epithelial tissue. So I hope you all understand. I hope you all can understand what the epithelial tissue is. It's basically a tissue that comes up and lines up any free surface in our body, let it be an internal surface or an external surface. If you find any free surface in your body, it's probably going to contain epithelial tissue, all right? So what are the functions of this epithelial tissue? Of course, like I told you, by being there, epithelial tissue definitely provides protection. You see, this epithelial tissue is lining up the free surfaces, right? The external surfaces, like on the skin and the tongue, and even the internal surfaces, right? Like in the nasal cavity or in the intestines. By being there, the epithelial tissue provides protection, all right? And in addition to protection, let's look at some other specific functions as well. For example, in the nasal cavity, this epithelial tissue has a secretory function where these epithelial tissues release something called mucus. All of you all have heard of mucus when we've learned about the respiratory system. So this mucus in the nasal cavity and the whole the respiratory tract is produced by these epithelial cells in the nasal cavity. So in addition to having a protective function, these specific epithelial cells also have a secretory function. They secrete mucus, right? And if we take the epithelial cells in the intestines and the digestive tract, these epithelial cells have a different function to do. See, within these intestines, there is food that is going through these intestines, right? Digested food products. The nutrients that you have eaten up are going through the inside of these intestines. So these epithelial cells within the intestines have the ability to absorb that food into the body. So absorption is another function of this specific epithelial tissue. The epithelial tissue in the intestines and the digestive tract have the ability to absorb nutrients into the blood. All right. So there is the secretory function, there's the absorptive function, there is the protective function. And in addition to that, the epithelial tissue, if you think about the epithelial tissue on the tongue, this has the ability to detect taste. You know how if you eat something, let's say you're eating an apple, you know, you get the taste of that food, right? So that taste is absorbed, that taste is perceived by the epithelial tissue on the tongue. So epithelium on the tongue has the ability to perceive taste. And even if you think about the epithelium in the nasal cavity, this epithelium has the ability to perceive smell, right? So perception of stimuli is done by the epithelium in the nasal cavity as well as the epithelium in the tongue. So that's basically what you need to know about the epithelial tissue, the locations of this tissue and also the functions that it performs. And one last thing that you all need to know about this tissue, what these epithelial cells look like under a microscope. So if you happen to observe these epithelial cells under a microscope, this is what it looks like. It's basically cells that look like this. You can see how when I'm drawing these cells are quite tightly packed. So there are no spaces in between the cells. They are tightly packed cells. And all the cells are placed on a membrane. They're kind of like sitting on a membrane, and this is called the basement membrane. And if you take a closer look at the epithelial tissue, you can see that the epithelial tissue does not have blood running through it. So there's no blood supply to the epithelial tissue, but there is nerve supply to this tissue. So that's what you need to know about the epithelial tissue. And now I'm moving on to the second type of tissue, which is the connective tissue. Now, connective tissue, as the name suggests, is a tissue that connects and binds and supports organs and other tissues. And in our syllabus and in general, there are typically four categories of connective tissue. When we talk about connective tissue, there is connective tissue under our skin. Connective tissue under the skin. For example, if you take your fingers and pinch a part of your other hand, if you pinch up some skin, that part that comes up, the part just underneath the epithelial tissue is connective tissue under the skin. So we have that for connective tissue, and we have bone tissue. Our bones are also considered as connective tissue, and we have cartilage tissue. And the final connective tissue is the blood tissue. And in our syllabus, we are concentrating on the blood tissue only. So we're not going to go into detail about the other three types of connective tissue, but rather just into the blood tissue. Now, if you consider all of these connective tissues, what all of them have in common is that all these tissues have a matrix. They have a matrix in which the cells and fibers are embedded. So in all these connective tissues, you have like this matrix. You have something called a matrix. You can imagine this as a surrounding. And in this matrix, you have different types of cells and different types of fibers embedded in it. So that's the common thing shown by all these connective tissues, the fact that they all have a matrix in which the cells and fibers are embedded, right? So now let's start off with the blood tissue. Now, if we consider the blood tissue, let's take a drop of blood. I'm just going to draw a drop of blood. In this blood tissue, the matrix of this blood tissue is a liquid, and this liquid matrix is called, yes, it's called plasma. The the matrix of the blood tissue is called blood plasma. We've all heard of blood plasma, right? And inside this blood plasma, we find different types of cells. We find tiny little red blood cells and larger white blood cells, right? We find red blood cells and white blood cells and also platelets, tiny fragments of cells called platelets. And also, during certain instances, such as blood clotting, we'll find different types of fibers found in the blood as well. So that's what you need to know about the blood tissue. It has blood plasma as the matrix and different types of cells within it. The red blood cells are also called erythrocytes. The white blood cells are also called leukocytes, and the platelets are just these tiny fragments of cells that come into action during blood clotting. So what are the functions of the blood tissue? If you consider the blood tissue, the main function of the blood tissue is transportation. The blood tissue transports different substances around our body. For example, it transports oxygen, and in fact, oxygen is transported by the red blood cells in the blood. The red blood cells transport oxygen, and the plasma transports different other substances such as nutrients and excretory matter and so on. And if you consider the white blood cells, they produce, they fight against infection and they protect our body from diseases, and platelets help us in blood clotting. So that's all you need to know about the blood tissue and connective tissues as a whole. So with that, we have completed the epithelial tissue as well as the connective tissue.